You're listening to the UnSafe Bible with Pastor Ken Brown.
The God of the universe, though, stands ready to help. Always has, always will. But the response of the world here is, quite honestly, pathetic. They turn into a mutual aid society. To combat the situation presented to them by the one who controls everything, they have their own solution. Look to other people for help rather than the creator of the universe. Oh, and because they have a view of history that includes the spiritual, it gets worse.
We can be stubborn enough to seek help even when we're in a bad circumstance. When it comes to seeking God's help, we tend to prefer earthly methods over Him. Your aversion to seeking assistance from God is usually due to a lack of faith in Him. In the message of today, Pastor Ken explains how you can start relying on God at all times. The ways of the world are prone to lead you astray, but when you place your trust in your Creator, you can be confident that He will show you the right path. Well, let's join Pastor Ken in the book of Isaiah, chapter 41, as he continues his message, Reasoning in the Courtroom.
Verse 3, he had a different way of conquering too. He pursues them passing on in safety by a way he had not been traversing with his feet. Now, those he conquered did run and flee because the Assyrian Empire had created this idea that when you conquer somebody, you turn them all into slaves, you do bad things to them, and you burn their city to the ground. Cyrus didn't do that. He didn't do any of that. He would come in as kind of, I'm freeing you. I'm not a pillager, I'm a deliverer. Yeah, I'd like some help paying my bills, I might want some taxes and so forth, but he didn't destroy any cities. That was not his thing. He was rather releasing folks, and because the Assyrians had enslaved folks, he was saying, you can go home now. You don't live here. You're from over there. Go back. That's what he did. Now, because it's God who controls history, and God is the one who has stirred up this one from the east, who's moving swiftly through the nations, and he did move quickly. Since it's God who controls history, the natural and logical endpoint from this is very simple. What control do the nations have over their future? None. Zero. What control does the United States have over its future right now? None. It's all in God's hands. What control does any nation in the world, China or Russia or Europe, what control do they have over their own future? None. The Lord is in control. He's in control of it all. In Isaiah 41:4, it says this, who has performed and accomplished it, calling forth generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, am the first, and with the last I am He. He makes sure that you know this is the one who's in control of history. It's God. So, what particular weight to the Lord's claim is that Cyrus' victories are prophesied in advance? Well, He planned it back in creation. Because what He says is that what you see happening here with this guy that I'm calling 150 years from now to move and conquer goes all the way back to the beginning of time, because I am the God who created it all. Well, how's that possible? How can that be? Well, it can be because God, as we've already learned, is the creator God, and He's a totally different kind of God than the gods of the nations. He created the gods of the nations. They're fallen angels in most cases that are being worshiped and demanding worship in violation of what God wants. And He's talked to them in Psalm 82, and they've got a future which they're not going to like. But who's the one in control of history? And here in this verse, God tells us who it is. He says, I am. The I am is in control of history. In the Hebrew, He just says, I am. Where have we heard that before? Back in Exodus, didn't we? Yeah. What's being said here in verse 4 is a direct reference back to Exodus 3:14. God says to Moses, I am who I am. And He said, say to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Well, here, God is telling the nations, I am. I am. In other words, how can you be in control of history? It's simple. I am. He made everything. He's the creator. The nations are in rebellion to him. But I, Yahweh, am the first and the last. I am. They're dealing with the creator. That's who they're dealing with. The use of this term, by the way, in the courtroom, to any Jew who's reading this and hearing this, they know who this is. They immediately know who it is because he uses his own name as he starts communicating. And a Jew won't even mention it. They'll say Hashim, the name. They won't say the name. They'll just say the name. This self-introduction formula shows that God's in control over all of history. He's the one who acted and worked. He's the one who's done and performed. He's the one who has directed the course of history from creation to the point in time that this is taking place, which is 700 BC, and to the point in time that we're standing today in 2021. God is the one who controls it all. He's the one who's putting up and taking down, and he's the reason why that maybe the guy that you don't want to have be in the White House is not in the White House. It's the Lord. He's behind all of this. We can't forget that. So as you take a look at the military history of the world, like World War II and like the Civil War, all military history is simply the outworking of God's divine plan. Well, no, war is basically selfishness. It's selfish people trying to do something. Yeah, it is. In many cases, it's spiritual warfare that suddenly flares up on the physical plane. But at the end of the day, you look at sometimes who wins and you're going like, that's weird. They shouldn't have won. They should have been this other power. Well, God's in control. God is always in control. He's always been that. He's the ultimate strategist. He controls history. And it's always been like that because there's no other God who preceded him, and there is no other God who will succeed him. Jesus said in John 8:58, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." And the Pharisees got it. They wanted to kill him because they understood he was saying he is God. They got it. Dealing with Gentiles, the nations, Jesus expressed just who he is, exactly who he is, just before he went to the cross. As he is being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, up they come running to arrest him. And who are you looking for? Well, in verse 5 of John 18, they answered him, Jesus from Nazareth. And Jesus told them in the Greek, ego eimi, I am. And Judas, the man who betrayed him, was standing with them. And when Jesus said, I am, they all backed away and fell to the ground. That's the only place, by the way, in the Bible where people are slain in the Spirit. Okay? Because Jesus is saying, I am, and all they could do is just fall down through the glory of that name. Then they all got back up and arrested him and crucified him. But we become crystal clear, though, as to who this person is. He's in control of history. He announced in advance the end goal of history. In advance, he said, he's coming back. And he does it in a way that we cannot miss. In Revelation 22, verses 12 and 13, Jesus says, see, I am coming soon. My reward is with me to repay everyone according to his action. I am the Alpha, the beginning, and the Omega, the end, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. And what did we just read here in Isaiah? Chapter 41, verse 4. He's at the beginning, he's at the end. It's the same one. The one who is announcing all of this in advance, and the one who is called this conqueror from the east, who's called Cyrus, is Yahweh, the God of Israel. Whoa, that's kind of a shocker to some of the world. I mean, I've got an announcement to make, and a lot of people won't like it, but there's a guy who's going to rule the entire planet. He happens to be Jewish, and he's going to rule from Jerusalem. Okay? It's coming real soon. When he comes back to earth, it's not to negotiate, it's to take over. The pronouns where he uses the word I am, he uses it twice. It's emphatic. In fact, the Good News Bible says I, the Lord, twice in order to draw out the emphasis. The adjective in the Hebrew is rendered in the same root as the first word. In other words, he is the one who's in control of eternity. He is eternal. And the Good News Bible really makes it very clear, very, very clear. Who was it that made this happen? Who has determined the course of history? I, the Lord, was there at the beginning, and I, the Lord, will be there at the end. Can't get much clearer than that, can you? That's what he's saying, okay? Yahweh was present at the beginning of history, a beginning which he predates because he's eternal. In fact, he invented history, he invented time. Time did not exist before he created it. Tying back to his previous comments in Isaiah 40, verse 12 and 13, all human history begins with him and with his actions as the creator God. No other God has done this, and no other God can do this. This will come out when he brings them into the courtroom. We'll find out they can't do anything. The nations will try and attribute this to some other God, or we have folks today who try to attribute all of this to some other cause. It just happened, right? The Big Bang, it's just one of those things. Evolution, we're all some monkey's uncle. No, it didn't happen that way. It didn't. Yahweh's the one who did this. He's the only one who can create everything out of nothing. Nobody else can. Only God can do this. Only God can say what we see John say in John 1, verses 1 to 5. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him there was nothing made that was made. In him is life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. With that simple statement in the first 5 verses of John, we find out that Jesus is the creator God. He's the one who made everything. We find out in Ephesians he holds it all together. And someday he's going to release a little bit of it, and it's going to be a bad day for those guys that he releases it for. It's a little place called Armageddon. The other possible way that you can read these lines is, I, Yahweh, am first, and with the last I am he. This reading, if you look at it this way, I am he, makes that an independent emphatic statement, which means I'm the one who did all of this, not some other so-called God. So he's the only God that's there. So either one of those work. I like the first one better. He's the beginning and the end. He's the one who ties it all together. But both are possible. The statement of I am, though, means that there's only one person who is truly worthy of worship from the entire planet, from the entire world. No one else is worthy of worship. Only one. Only one is truly God. Only one is the non-contingent being in the universe who relied on nothing else and created it all out of nothing. It's God. He's the only one who could have done this. No one else could have. No one. And we've talked about that already because it starts bringing up all the attributes of God again. Considering this simple fact and once again drawing together all that it means as we looked at Isaiah 40, how should the nations react? How do you think they should react? What should be their response? Oh, yeah, Lord, we agree. Yahweh's the Lord, and their future is wrapped up in him. So we have their response. God gives it to us. It starts in verse 5. The coastlands have seen, in other words, the nations, have seen and are afraid. The ends of the earth tremble. So here they are in the courtroom. They're scared out of their mind. They're trembling. Reminds me of what it says about demons, that they know who Jesus is and they tremble, but they're not believers. Book of James says that. They have drawn near and have come. Each one helps his neighbor and says to a brother, be strong. So the craftsman encourages the smelter, and he who smooths metal with the hammer encourages him who beats the anvil, saying of the soldering, it's good. And he fastens it with nails so it won't totter. Now, that first line gives us hope. Oh, maybe they're going to repent. Maybe they're going to do the right thing, right? Well, it's destroyed as we continue to read because they are actually engaged in putting fiction over truth. They've seen what's going on. They know what's going on with the one from the east. And this is also speaking, they know what's going on at the end of the age, too. They know who this one who's running rampant over the earth called the beast, this conqueror, they are truly in fear as they see what this person's doing. And out of that fear, they have a realization suddenly that they have no control over their future, none whatsoever. So what do? Do they turn to the Lord? No. They band together for mutual support. They create the mutual support agreement where they take care of each other. We've seen this before in the Bible, okay? This is not the first time. The first time there was no threat, none. God made a simple demand of the people. And it's right after the flood. He said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the planet. Just go out and have babies and go out over the entire planet. So what did Noah's kids do? We don't want to spread out across the planet. We're going to stay in one place. The Tigris-Euphrates Valley is really nice. Let's stay here and build this really big tower and try and recreate what was going on back in Genesis 6, because we want the gods again. You know, God gave them what they wanted and split them up into 70 different language groups. How do you like that? And then split them up with different false gods. Well, eventually they were false gods. They weren't initially, they were administrators, but they wound up being false gods as they demanded worship. But the nations had a better idea. They banded together to rebel against the commandment of God at a place called Babel. It didn't work. It didn't end well. The decision that they make in verse 5 is consistent with the decision that we see related in Psalm chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Why are the nations so angry? Why do they waste their time with futile plans? Have you ever noticed that? Why do they waste their time doing what they do? I mean, it's kind of like, really? I used to have to read all this foreign affairs stuff because in the Air Force, it's one of those things you're expected as an officer to know what's going on worldwide. The more you read, the more you don't care. You know, or you reach my point where you walk in the office in the morning and say, who are we at war with today? You know, and it gets that bad sometimes. But here in Psalm chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, why are the nations so angry? Why do they waste their time with futile plans? The kings of the earth prepare for battle. The rulers plot together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Now, this is actually talking about the preparation for Armageddon, and we know how that ends. It doesn't end well for them. But from the fear of the nations in general, we wonder what's going on with the people in each of these nations. So God shows us. They're busy propping each other up. Each one helps his neighbor and says to his brother, be strong. Do we see that in the news today where the nations are doing something and every so often you hear one nation say to them, be strong. Don't worry about this. We'll help you. We'll ally with you. Join our Belt and Road organ. Different nations have different ways of trying to get folks to join with them. And that's what they're doing. The God of the universe, though, stands ready to help. Always has, always will. But the response of the world here is, quite honestly, pathetic. They turn into a mutual aid society. To combat the situation presented to them by the one who controls everything, they have their own solution. Look to other people for help rather than the creator of the universe. Oh, and because they have a view of history that includes the spiritual, it gets worse. Verse 7. So the craftsman encourages the smelter, and he who smooths metal with the hammer encourages him who beats the anvil, saying of the soldering, it's good. And he fastens it with nails so it'll not totter. I read that, and the first thing that crosses my mind is, really? That's all you got? Build a really big idol? Well, a little idol won't, it's got to be a big idol. Really big, but we're going to have to make sure it doesn't fall over because it's kind of top heavy. So it'll thump on its face. We can't do that, so we'll build a really big idol and nail it to the wall. You know, the nations were commanded by God to listen. They're not listening. He intends to give them a chance to speak, but they got other ideas. We're going to solve our problem ourselves. So rather than listen to the Lord and turn to him, they turn to their own solutions that won't even stand on their own 2 feet, but have to be propped up. The only solution the nations have universally come up with is, let's continue to pander to the fallen ones. Let's continue to listen to those voices that keep telling us, do this, do this, do this, do this, because that's where the answers are. Worship and rely only on what you think you can control. So they'll have their state church, or they won't have a church at all, or they'll worship atheism or whatever, but they'll have something that they worship. And out of this emerges the need to have spiritual power on their side, but you know, when you build your own God, it can't exceed your skill, can it? It's only as good as your capabilities to build it. And it involves human approval and human stability, and at the end of the day, it's just nothing more than a projection of our own weakness, and it's going to go poof, right on its nose, which is where I wind up when I try to do things on my own all the time. I fall flat on my face. And that's what's going to happen here. So as God sees the nations turning towards the worship of no gods, Yahweh turns to his people. Now remember, his people are in the courtroom, they're witnesses. And some commentators will say, well, this is a pause in the courtroom scene. I just look at it as God's talking to the nations. He's seeing what they're doing. And he's just, like that. And he's turning over. Now he comes over and he talks to the Jews, his people. And he's going to encourage them. He's going to tell his people, remember who you are and who you were. So he starts with this in verse 8. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I've chosen, descendant of Abraham, my friend, you whom I've taken from the ends of the earth and called from its remotest parts, and said to you, you are my servant. That's important. This is the first time Isaiah ever calls Israel God's servant. I've chosen you and not rejected you. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not anxiously look about you, for I'm your God. I will strengthen you. Surely I will help you. Surely I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Now, the way that the Lord does this is he uses both names. He uses Israel to emphasize that's the new name for Jacob, but then he brings that name Jacob, which basically means heel catcher, crook, conniver. And he says, but you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, remember Jacob, the crook? I chose him. And because he's a descendant of Abraham, my friend. They need to remember that. They absolutely need, and he calls them his servant. By the way, we are his servants. In fact, Jesus says we're his friends. A little different relationship with him. And he compares Israel to his servant Jacob, and because of his choosing Jacob, who is a descendant of his friend Abraham, Israel is indeed the servant of God. But by adding in the comparative, God is reflecting how this is simply him being consistent with his nature and the covenant that he made with Abraham and then reconfirmed with Jacob. The reference to the calling of Abraham, remember Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees, the ends of the earth if you're in Jerusalem. It reflects to the election of God. It's not reversible. God chose them. It's a done deal. He won't change his mind. God chose you and me if we're believers in Jesus Christ, and he won't change his mind. He doesn't. He can't, because it's against his nature. It's not one of his attributes. You know, the only thing that God can forget and that he chooses to forget is the moment we give our life to Jesus Christ, he chooses to forget our sin. It's the only thing he chooses to forget. I continue to be amazed at what the Lord has done for me. For Israel, the servant of God, the solution's simple. Don't freak out. The nations are freaking out. They're building their own solution. Don't freak out. Don't try and make your own salvation. Just look to the Lord and rest in him. Remember what it said the last few verses of chapter 40? Just rest in God. Here in verse 10, Israel's told, don't fear, don't be anxious. When this conqueror is busy moving through the land, don't worry about it.
It's true that some of us are introverts and some of us are extroverts. But did you know Jesus designed us to function best when we're part of a community? We all have God-given gifts and abilities that, when used rightly and in conjunction with others, the effect for the kingdom of God will be profound. It will reach many who are lost and hurting. So, listeners, if you don't have a community that you belong to, won't you consider getting connected with ours? Or at least learning what we believe and why? The UnsafeBible.com has all that information, and we'd encourage you to read what's written there and then spend some time in prayer. The Unsafe Bible is a radio ministry based out of Jupiter, Florida. And we're so glad that you've paused long enough to listen to today's message from Pastor Ken. If you like what you heard today, and we've piqued your curiosity, why don't you satisfy it by checking out all the other messages we have for you? Go to the unsafebible.com and click on the Media tab. That's the direct link to our archive. We trust that what you find there will challenge and grow your faith. While you're there, be sure to check out the other ways to stay connected with what's happening here at Calvary Chapel, Martin County. Would you rather enjoy connecting through social media? You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Pick your favorite platform, or utilize all three. We trust that today's message from Isaiah spoke to your heart and challenged the parts of you that aren't looking like Jesus. Thanks for listening to the UnSafe Bible.